Some things you can forgive, even when they leave scars. But what do you do when the people you trusted never saw you at all? My name is Irina. I'm 34 years old, and I live a quiet life just outside Asheville, North Carolina. I work as a freelance graphic designer, and I have a small circle of friends who feel more like family than the one I was born into. I guess you could say I've built my life to be peaceful, on purpose, because the home I grew up in rarely felt that way. I don't carry anger with me anymore. Not the way I used to, but sometimes, small moments still bring it all back, like a certain song on the radio, or the way a room goes still when old memories surface. It happened last fall. We were all gathered at my parents' house, the old colonial. They refused to leave, no matter how creaky the floors get or how many shingles blow off in a storm. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner, one of those rare occasions where everyone tried to smile a little harder than they meant to, like patching over cracks that ran too deep to fix. There were my brothers, Andrew and Caleb, flanking my parents at the head of the long oak table. Their wives, polished and laughing, fit in perfectly. And then there was me, a little off to the side, like I'd wandered into someone else's photograph. I noticed the wrapped boxes tucked neatly on the sideboard as soon as I walked in. Old ones. Heavy ones. Some were wrapped in faded linen, others were tied carefully with string. The kind of boxes that only came out for moments that were supposed to matter. I didn't ask. I smiled, set down the pie I had baked, and helped clear the cluttered countertop, without being asked. When dinner ended and the plates were scraped clean, my mother stood and cleared her throat. She made a small, formal speech about family legacy, about treasures passed down, stories that lived through generations. Then she began handing out the heirlooms. My grandmother's sapphire ring went to Andrew, my grandfather's gold pocket watch to Caleb. There were old letters, black and white photographs, even a quilt stitched by hands long gone. I sat there waiting, telling myself not to expect anything, telling myself I didn't care. And when every last piece had been given out, when the boxes were empty and the room buzzed with polite excitement, my mother looked over at me. She smiled, that tight. Apologetic smile she reserved for things she didn't plan to explain, and said, "You understand, don't you, honey? Some things are meant for those who'll carry them properly." I nodded. Because what else was there to do? But something cracked open quietly inside me that night. A small, persistent voice that had been silent for too long finally stirred. And for the first time in a long time, I realized maybe the story I'd been told about who I was and where I belonged wasn't the full truth after all. Growing up, it was the little things that taught me where I stood, not the grand gestures, not the major moments. Those were too rare anyway. It was at the birthday parties where my brother's cakes were stacked taller, candles brighter, gifts louder. It was in the casual way their accomplishments were framed on the living room wall, while my quiet report cards got a nod at best, filed away in a drawer no one ever opened twice. At first, I thought it was normal. Every family had favorites, didn't they? Every little girl had to work a little harder to be seen, to be celebrated. At least that's what I told myself when Andrew got a brand new bike for winning a spelling bee, and I got a firm pat on the shoulder for making the honor roll. It wasn't that my parents were cruel. They loved in their own way, measured, orderly with expectations tucked neatly into every hug. But love, in our house, was conditional. It had a ledger, though no one ever admitted it out loud. Andrew was the golden boy, charming, athletic, always the life of the party. Caleb was the quiet strength, dependable, easygoing, just rebellious enough to be fun. And me? I was the responsible one, the peacemaker, the extra set of hands when things got messy. I learned early that my value lay in what I could fix, what I could shoulder without complaint. It wasn't resentment I carried, not exactly. It was more like invisibility. A slow, steady erosion of being seen as more than just useful. When I was 12, I remember standing in the attic with my mother, sorting through boxes of old family keepsakes. There were antique brooches wrapped in faded silk, hand-stitched quilts, dusty, albums with curling photographs. She held up a silver locket once, delicate with a tiny blue stone set in its center, and smiled softly. "This," she said, "will go to the daughter who reminds me most of my grandmother. Strong-willed, spirited." I reached for it without thinking, my heart stuttering in my chest. But her gaze slid past me, resting warmly on the stairwell where Caleb leaned, grinning at something on his phone. My hand fell back to my side. Moments like that don't leave bruises you can point to. They settle under the skin, woven into the quiet spaces where self-worth should live. Over time, I taught myself not to expect too much, to celebrate the victories I earned, even when no one clapped, to treasure the friendships I built outside those walls, to tuck away the hurt in places no one could touch. Still, the talk of heirlooms became a kind of mythology in our family, spoken of in reverent tones over holiday dinners, polished and passed around like relics from a better time. Great-grandmother's engagement ring, crafted by hand in a little shop in Charleston. The antique piano that survived 2 floods and a cross-country move. A pocket watch rumored to have been carried through the trenches of World War I. It was always understood that these weren't just objects. They were promises, symbols of belonging, proof that you were part of something bigger than yourself. But even in the way the stories were told, I understood deep down that they weren't really meant for me, not because I lacked history. I had lived every chapter right alongside my brothers, but because in my parents' eyes, I was always slightly adjacent, near enough to help carry the weight of the family name, but not close enough to inherit it. There's a peculiar kind of loneliness that comes from being needed, but not cherished, from being trusted with responsibilities, but not with dreams. I didn't rebel. I didn't shout or slam doors or demand more than they were willing to give. Instead, I became exactly what they praised: independent, self-sufficient, uncomplaining, a model daughter, a quiet disappointment. The time I was old enough to leave home, I knew how to take care of myself. What I hadn't figured out yet was how to believe I deserved to be cared for. And so when the night came, the night of the heirlooms, the night of the hollow smiles, and empty boxes, it didn't feel like a sudden betrayal. It felt like the final, silent confirmation of a truth I had been trying to ignore for most of my life. They never truly saw me. Not really. And the ache that settled in my chest that evening wasn't just for the heirlooms I would never hold. It was for the version of me that had waited all these years to be claimed, and finally understood she never would be. It started with a phone call in late September, the kind that feels harmless at first. Just another piece of family logistics, slipped into the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Mom's voice was warm but brisk, like always. "We're having a little get-together next month," she said. "Something special. You'll come, won't you?" I said I would, even though something in her tone made my stomach tighten. There was an edge of ceremony to it, something I hadn't heard before. Over the next few weeks, small comments trickled through the family group chat. Andrew was joking about finally getting his hands on the good stuff. Caleb is dropping hints about needing a new safe for important documents. I tried not to read too much into it. I tried to believe I was overthinking, like I always did. But deep down, a small protective part of me braced itself for disappointment. When the day finally arrived, the sky hung heavy with the scent of rain. I drove to my parents' house with a pie balanced carefully on the passenger seat, the way I had for years. Still trying. Still showing up. The house looked the same. White paint peeling at the corners, porch light flickering against the early dusk. Inside, the air buzzed with a strange, bright energy. Not the awkward warmth of forced family dinners, but something sharper, something expectant. There were gifts wrapped in tissue paper stacked neatly along the mantel, polished silver trays set out with delicate glasses. It felt like Christmas without the tree, only tighter, tenser. Everyone was there. Andrew and Caleb, with their wives, arms linked possessively. My mother was bustling between rooms, her cheeks flushed with excitement. My father was lingering near the fireplace, a brandy in hand, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. We made small talk for a while, nibbling on cheese and crackers. I noticed no one asked about my work or my friends or anything really beyond the polite basics. The conversation floated over me like I was a guest at someone else's celebration. Eventually, Mom clinked her glass with a spoon. "Thank you all for coming," she said, beaming. "As you know, it's been a tradition in this family to pass down the things that matter most, the things that tell our story." I smiled politely, heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it didn't matter. Those heirlooms were just things. That belonging wasn't measured in silver and gold. One by one, she began handing them out. Andrew was given the sapphire cufflinks that had belonged to our great-grandfather. Caleb received the gold pocket watch, worn thin at the edges from a lifetime of hands winding it with care. There were family portraits, black and white, mounted carefully behind glass, placed gently into their arms. I watched it all unfold like a movie I hadn't been cast in. My name wasn't called. My place in the story remained undefined. Then, at the very end, my mother reached for a small box tucked behind the others. It was unwrapped. Just a simple cardboard box with no ribbon, no fanfare. She crossed the room and pressed it into my hands with a smile so thin it barely existed. Inside was a cracked ceramic dish, faded around the edges, chipped in 3 places. On the bottom, a peeling sticker that read, 50C. I stared at it for a moment too long. Then I looked up and met her eyes. "You understand, don't you, Irina?" she said, voice syrupy with misplaced kindness. "Some things are meant for those who will truly carry them forward." The words slipped past my ears, landing somewhere deep and dark inside me. I nodded. What else could I do? There was no fight to pick, no scene to make. I placed the box carefully on the nearest table and excused myself to the kitchen, claiming I needed some air. No one followed. I stood by the back door, staring out, at the rain-soaked garden, hands trembling just slightly. The chipped dish was still in my hands, as if it might anchor me to something I couldn't name. That night, after hugs were exchanged and goodbyes mumbled, I drove home in silence. No music, no calls. Just the sound of my own breathing and the relentless voice in my head whispering what I had tried so hard not to hear. You were never really part of their story. You were tolerated, expected to serve, to smile, to accept. Not chosen, not treasured. And suddenly, it wasn't just about a cracked dish or forgotten heirlooms. It was about every birthday card signed late, every family photo where I stood just a little outside the frame, every whispered conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I didn't cry that night. Tears would have been too easy. Instead, I felt a slow, hollow shift inside me, like a door closing softly on a room I'd been trying to keep open for too long. The funny thing about loss is, sometimes it doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes it's 100 little cuts. You learn to ignore, until one day you realize you're bleeding out and no one ever noticed. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I turned the cracked dish over in my hands. It was lighter than I thought it would be, almost meaningless. Almost. Because it wasn't the weight of the dish that mattered. It was the weight of everything. It didn't say. And I knew, deep in my bones, that something had to change. Not in them. In me. It's strange how some memories wait in the shadows for years, silent and still, until the right kind of hurt brings them blinking into the light. After that night at my parents' house, after the empty boxes and the cracked dish, one memory in particular wouldn't leave me alone. I was about 8 years old. It had been a hot summer afternoon, the kind where the air feels sticky and slow. My brothers were outside, shouting and chasing each other around the backyard while I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, piecing together a jigsaw puzzle. I wasn't trying to listen to the adults talking in the kitchen. At that age, you learn to make yourself invisible when grown-ups are around. But sometimes you hear things anyway. My mother was laughing, a soft, strained kind of laugh she used when she was uncomfortable. My Aunt Sylvia, her older sister, was the one speaking. "I mean, she's sweet," Aunt Sylvia said. "But she doesn't really look like you or Tom, does she?" There was a pause. A long, heavy pause. "She's ours," my mother said finally, her voice clipped, defensive. "I didn't mean anything by it," Sylvia added quickly. "It's just, sometimes kids take after someone else." Another pause. Then the clinking of ice cubes in glasses. The conversation shifted, mercifully, to other things. Upcoming birthdays, whose turn it was to host Thanksgiving. But I sat there, staring at the puzzle piece in my hand, feeling suddenly unsure where I fit. I didn't ask questions back then. I didn't know how to put into words the small, sharp ache blooming in my chest. Instead, I tucked it away. Like a loose thread, you notice but decide not to pull. As I got older, there were other moments. An uncle squinting at me during a family reunion and saying, "You sure you're one of us?" with a chuckle, like it was a harmless joke. A neighbor commented that I had different coloring than my brothers. Lighter hair, paler skin, a sharper chin. Even the way my father sometimes looked at me. Fond, but distant. Like I was a picture he appreciated without fully recognizing it. At the time, I learned to brush it off. To laugh when others laughed. To be grateful for what I had, even if it didn't always feel like it fully belonged to me. But after the heirloom night, after sitting alone with a chipped dish and the cold weight of being overlooked yet again, those old memories lined up in my mind with painful clarity. Maybe it hadn't just been favoritism. Maybe it hadn't just been about my brothers fitting into the mold more neatly. Maybe there was something else. Something no one had ever told me. The idea sat with me quietly for a few days, like a small stone in my shoe. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my coworkers. It wasn't anger that pushed me toward the truth. It wasn't some burning need for confrontation. It was something quieter, something almost tender. A longing to finally understand the shape of my own story. To stop guessing where I belonged. To stop fitting myself into a family portrait where the outlines had never truly included me. For the first time in a long time, I realized I owed myself the full picture, no matter how complicated or uncomfortable it might be. And so, one evening as the sun dipped behind the trees outside my kitchen window, I opened my laptop and ordered a DNA test. Not out of revenge, not out of bitterness, just for peace, for clarity, for myself. The DNA kit sat on my kitchen counter for a week before I finally opened it. It wasn't fear that held me back. It was something closer to respect, for the version of myself that had endured so long without knowing, without demanding answers. The process was simple enough. Few minutes, a sealed envelope, and a postage stamp later, it was out of my hands. And then came the waiting. I didn't think about it much during the day. Work kept me busy, errands filled the spaces between. But at night, when the world softened and grew quiet, I found myself wondering, would it even matter? Would the results really change anything? A part of me already knew the answer. The email arrived 3 weeks later. I opened it with the kind of careful, deliberate calm that only comes after you've learned to expect nothing. The words were clinical, precise, undeniable. My DNA showed no biological link to either of my parents. None. It should have knocked the breath out of me. It should have sent me reeling. But instead, I felt still, as if something heavy I had been carrying for years had finally been set down. Not because I had been betrayed, but because, for once, I had proof that my confusion, my aching sense of otherness, had never been imagined. It was real. And now, I was free to decide what to do with that truth. For a few days I did nothing. I sat with it. Let it settle inside me like a stone dropped gently into deep water. I thought about the cracked dish, the heirlooms passed over without my name on them. The family portraits were where I stood just a little too far from the center. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel the need to storm into my parents' house, waving papers in the air. Instead, I felt something softer. A quiet insistence that I owed it to myself, just as I had owed it to myself to search for the truth, to speak it out loud. Not for their understanding, not for their apology, but for my own closure. So, I sat at my desk one evening, the late autumn sun slanting gold through the window, and I wrote them a letter. It wasn't long. It wasn't angry. I simply explained what I had discovered. I attached a copy of the DNA results, and I told them, politely, firmly, that I would be stepping back from the family, at least for a while. Not out of punishment, but because I needed space to understand who I was without the constant ache of trying to belong. I hit send and closed my laptop. Then I made myself a cup of tea and watched the last leaves tumble from the trees outside. There was no immediate response. No phone call, no knock at the door, just silence. And in that silence, I found a kind of peace I hadn't expected. When their replies finally came, they were as careful as I had imagined. My mother wrote a short email, thick with confusion and defensiveness. "We always loved you," she insisted. "This doesn't change anything." My father's message was even shorter. "Family isn't just blood," he wrote. "You know that." Andrew and Caleb didn't reach out at all. I read their words slowly, absorbing them without anger. Because they were right, in a way. Family isn't just blood. It's about seeing someone fully, loving them as they are, claiming them even when it's inconvenient. And in that sense, I realized they had never truly been my family. Not in the way I needed. Not in the way that mattered. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I made a quiet decision. One that felt both monumental and beautifully simple. I let them go. Not with bitterness, not with rage, but with the deep, aching relief of someone finally choosing herself. I packed up the cracked dish, wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, placed it in a box, and left it on my parents' porch one evening. No note, no explanation, just the final piece of a puzzle I no longer needed to finish. Driving away under the soft glow of the streetlights, I didn't look back. Some endings don't need fanfare. Some closures are meant to be quiet, just a door closing softly behind you, and a wide open road stretching out ahead. The first morning after leaving the cracked dish on my parents' porch, I woke up lighter. Not euphoric, not triumphant, just lighter. Like a door that had been wedged open for too long had finally swung shut behind me with a soft, certain click. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to check my phone for missed messages or wonder if today would be the day they would finally say the words I had waited so long to hear. I wasn't waiting anymore. I understood something now, something I hadn't had the courage to name before. The heirlooms, the rings, the watches, the quilts, the portraits, they were never really mine to lose. And maybe, The family I had fought so hard to belong to wasn't either. That realization wasn't cruel. It wasn't even sad. Not in the way I might have expected. It was freeing. Because if I didn't owe my identity to the blood that didn't run through my veins, or the heirlooms that had skipped past my hands, then I was free to choose where I belonged. Who do I belong to? And slowly, almost without noticing, I realized I already had. There was Mia, my best friend since college, who had shown up at my doorstep at 2 a.m. with hot cocoa and terrible movies when my first apartment flooded. There was David, my neighbor-turned-confidant, who always remembered my birthday without needing a Facebook reminder, and once fixed my broken porch swing without asking for anything in return. There was the small but stubborn community I had built around my work, clients who trusted me, colleagues who cheered my successes, even when they were small. There were the friends who knew the songs that made me cry, the stories that made me laugh, the dreams I was too shy to say out loud. They weren't bound to me by blood or obligation. They chose me. And I chose them. Maybe that, in the end, was the only family that ever really mattered. Some nights, I still think about what might have been. About the childhood birthdays, the graduations, the whispered jokes around the dinner table, all the invisible threads that could have tied us tighter if things had been different. I let myself grieve for those lost possibilities, for the girl who waited so patiently for a place at the table that was never set for her. But grief doesn't scare me anymore. It isn't a dark, endless thing. It's just a companion now, quiet, respectful, sitting with me when I need it and leaving when I don't. I honor what I lost, and then I let it go. Last week, I found myself wandering through a small antique shop downtown, the kind with dust motes dancing in the light and creaky floors that sing when you walk across them. On a cluttered shelf near the back, I spotted a ceramic dish, this one bright and uncracked, painted with small blue forget-me-nots around the rim. Without thinking, I picked it up. It wasn't valuable. It wasn't historic. But it was beautiful. And it was mine. I brought it home, washed it gently in warm, soapy water, and placed it on my kitchen counter. A small, simple reminder that not every story we inherit is ours to carry. And that sometimes, the most precious heirlooms are the ones we choose for ourselves. I don't know if my parents ever told my brothers about the DNA results. I don't know if they ever sit together now, glancing at the empty chair where I used to be. Maybe they do. Maybe they don't. It doesn't matter anymore. Because I'm not standing in that doorway, waiting to be invited in. I'm not holding my breath for a love that comes with conditions, for belonging that must be earned. I have built my own home, my own family, my own story, and it's enough. It's more than enough.